Hello all, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale Dragon M4A3 Sherman tank. Since the last video, progress has been made to the model's hull, and as well as many revisions have been made to the stock Dragon kit, which we'll be going over in this video. Before I can continue with the video, let's first step back to an earlier stage of this model's construction in order to get a handle on some things that need to have been made to the model in order to get it up to this point that we see. The model is now ready to be started. Now, a couple questions I get asked quite frequently is what glues and adhesives do you use to glue one of these large Dragon plastic kits together? And for that, it's actually very simple. I like to use the standard Testors red tube model glue along with Pro Thick CA from Great Plains. The Great Plains CA is an adhesive I use on all of my 1/6 scale vehicles, and I've used it on such vehicles from rotomolded plastic Panzers tanks all the way up to Armortex. The CA itself works very good with binding resin, plastic, as well as any other materials needed to build one of these 1/6 scale tanks together. The plastic model glue, it's good for binding polystyrene to polystyrene, and does give you a nice strong bond. However, I like to utilize the CA in conjunction with the red tube glue, for the simple fact that the red glue, even though it does have a nice strong secure bond, over time the bond will begin to deteriorate. This is specifically true if you ever handled any models that are over 20 to 30 years old. The glues start to lose their bonding and the models will begin to have parts fall off of them. If you back up your glued surfaces with CA, this reduces the factor of that immensely. Once you're ready to actually start on the model, the instructions on page 1 are going to tell you to go ahead and assemble the suspension, which is typical for that of any 1/6 or any 1/35 scale model. On my 1/6 scale models, however, I like to start with having the hull as one complete unit. Once the hull is one unit, I then progress to the suspension and work my way up until the tank is completed. This model will be no different. The first place I'm going to start with on this build is going to be the transmission cover. The transmission cover itself is a nice unit, and all the parts are supplied with the kit to assemble it very quickly. Now, one thing to keep of note, this is for anyone who's watching this video who's not used to working with these 1/6 scale Dragon plastic kits, is that even though the pieces are polystyrene and do have runners like that of your traditional plastic model kit, where the joints meet the runner and the component are a lot thicker than that of your standard 1/35 scale model, or even 1/16 scale model. Because of that, using a hobby knife for a box cutter, or even clean cut snips, will not be suffice at doing the job. For this application, I highly recommend the Dremel Multimax. The Multimax is an oscillating tool that can cleanly remove the unneeded material nice and cleanly. That's completely flush with the unit that will leave room for little, if any, type of sanding with a file or sandpaper. The Multimax makes quick work of the polystyrene, and once removed, the piece could then progress with its construction. To demonstrate how to cut the piece, I have the Multimax as well as the runner, and I will be using the Multimax in real time to show just how to cut the piece off of the sprue. And the piece has been desprued. While working on the transmission cover, I found that some of the tolerances on this kit are somewhat a little loose. It's nothing to worry about, and it's just something to keep in mind when you're building one of these vehicles. I've ran into this so far on the transmission cover. If you notice, the kit has a ledge in which you would take the transmission side, add the glue, and glue it nice and snug to the ledge. Problem is when you do that is that you're going to see a 1/16 of an inch little recess form around the piece. If you glue both sides to the tightness of the shelf, when it comes time to insert it into the hull, you're going to find that the transmission cover is going to be slightly too small. So when you're gluing this piece on, be sure to glue it on so that the sides are nice and flush with that of the transmission cover. Once the sides are on nice and flush, you'll have a better fit with that of the lower hull. Once assembled, the unit will look like this. The pieces are nice and flush with that of the transmission cover. And now you just need to let the glues dry before you continue with adding on the CA as a reinforcement. And then to what I'm going to be doing is going to be adding the rest of the cast texture as well as a few other details to this piece. While I'm progressing on the transmission cover, you'll notice that on the transmission cover casting itself, there is a small little strip that is molded into the transmission cover. This strip is another carryover from the 1/35 scale tanks, and this strip here is meant to replicate the support brace that is actually for the sheet metal fender. On Shermans, there's a little support brace as welded to the fender, and then it goes ahead and gives it support by sitting here on top of the transmission cover. Since I will be replacing these with actual sheet metal versions from ECA, the molded in ones are not going to be necessary and needed, so they will need to be deleted. To delete them, I went ahead and used this bit here on a Dremel. It's like a razor type drum. This type of bit here makes very quick work of removing of the strip. Once the strip has been removed, I will go ahead and sand it down flush with the help of a palm sander. Once the strip is removed, the entire transmission itself is ready for its next step. The demal kit also comes with the toe eyes for the front transmission cover. The kit supply toe eyes are the correct shape and do have the correct thickness. They also easily mount onto the kit transmission cover in that the kit does have the slots molded into the transmission cover, which makes installation very easy. One thing though, as of note, is that the internal version of the toe eyes have this elaborate casting to them. Now on the real Sherman tank, this is incorrect. Real Sherman tank, these toe eyes were just two slabs of steel that were integrally cast into the transmission cover. So the reason that DML went with this elaborate casting to make these components is I can't really explain. To fill this in, you could use standard putty and body filler. However, on these two pieces here, I'm going to be filling in these two recesses with that of casting resin. As for the other toe eyes, they are a solid type shape, which is accurate. However, they also have molded in this integral footman loop. This is true on the Sherman tank in that they had several foot loops that would have been welded to the toe eye, which connects then to the corner blister here of the transmission cover. The footman loop that you see here will be replaced in that it is far too thick and clunky for to replicate that on the Sherman. This will be removed and a new one will be fabricated out of sheet metal in its place. And here goes the front transmission cover with all the modifications complete. As we can see, the entire transmission cover itself has been covered with its smooth cast texture. The cast texture itself is hand applied and will really pop out after the model is painted. If we notice, the cast texture has not been added to the areas where the final drive goes. This ensures that the final drive locations are going to be nice and flush with the hull, which will aid in alignment. The transmission cover is complete with also its casting numbers added to it, and in addition to its casting numbers, the toe eyes have their modifications completed as well. As we recall from before, the toe eyes are somewhat hollow in their molding, and they were filled in. As well as being filled in, they were then blended into the rest of the bodywork, like you see here. Like I mentioned before, the foot loop was integrally molded into this component was a bit on the thick and clunky side. So the molded in version was replaced with that of a bent brass version, and sculpted welds were added in its place as well. In addition to the toe eye modification, another addition that I added to the transmission cover that was missing on the original kit is that of the drainage plug detailing. The drainage plugs are found on these two lower portions here of the Sherman transmission, and this is common from all of the transmissions that were used on the Sherman family. Basically what they do is that when you need to drain the fluid in the transmission to get access to the transmission gears, you loosen these two bungs over here, which will then drain out all the fluid inside the transmission cover. Like I mentioned before, these details are missing on the stock DML kit, but were added on this model here. Moving our way to the model's rear plate. The model's rear plate that you see here is its stock configuration, and it is all molded as one piece. A lot of you 1/35 scale model makers out there will recognize this plate as nothing more than a supersized, blown up version of the ones typically found on smaller scale 1/35 scale Shermans. Namely, if we notice, the toe eyes are solid, they're not pre-drilled out on the kit, as well as the molded in rear engine hatch. The exhaust manifold setups are also right here, as well as the rear idler mount plates. Most of the details on this plate here are going to be replaced with better aftermarket details from EastCoastArmory.com, and this plate here will undergo a little bit of a transformation. And here goes the rear firewall after the revisions have been made. The revisions include the removal of the original rear engine access hatch, the removal of the mounts for the exhaust stacks, and the removal of the mounts for the original kit idler mounts. Starting with the rear hatch, the original kit supplied hatch was molded into the plate, as we recall, and once removal of the molded in hatch left an area which was larger than that of the EastCoastArmory.com hatch. In order to make the tank fit the EastCoastArmory.com hatch, I built up the inside portion of where the hatch was with strips of evergreen styrene. I went ahead and used this version here. The styrene itself are in strips and are the same exact thickness as the hull itself, so gluing the parts together, gluing the strips to the hull wall was very easy. After the strips were all glued on, I marked where the hatch was going to go, and with a file, I went ahead and filed down the area of the plastic in order to make the hatch fit on nice and smooth like we have here. The hatch itself is going to be affixed to the vehicle after the firewall is mounted to the lower hull. As for the exhaust locations as well as the idler mount locations, like with the hatch, once you remove the molded in area, there is a very large hole that remains left in the plate. In order to plug these up, I went ahead and actually developed Resin Inserts to help with the modification of the tank. The Resin Inserts are listed on the EastCoastArmory.com product line and simply get inserted onto the back portion here of the plate. Once the segment is removed, these plugs are the perfect fit for the removed area on the model. Once you remove the molded in section, you simply just take the resin component and glue it to the back portion of the wall. Once the piece is glued on, you could do a little bit of putty work just to make sure everything's nice and flush, but it gives you the structure necessary that was missing once this large portion of the hull was removed. With this structure here in place, it now makes a very great access point for fixing the replacement EastCoastArmory.com components. This is for both the idler mounts as well as the exhaust manifolds. If you notice, the exhaust manifold will now simply get bolted to this location here once time comes. The last modification that I made to the rear plate was drilling out the toe shackle mounts that we have here. Like I mentioned earlier, these are solid, integrally casted into the rear plate and do not have their holes present. To add the hole was a simple addition. I simply put a bit into the drill press, I braced it against the drill press table, and I just went ahead and drilled out the holes. Once the holes are drilled out, it gives you a lot of nice detail that didn't take a whole lot of effort to do. Now, the only thing that remains is to mount this plate to the tank. Once the plate is mounted, I could then add on the tow hitch mount, as well as add the missing welds, which are lacking on the kit original piece. And here goes the hull, now glued together as one piece. If we notice, I went ahead and used masking tape to go ahead and keep the two halves together. This was done so that while the glues are adhering, the hull is perfectly lined up with the sponson. Because of the size of the model, when you're bolting it together, the sides are going to want to open up on you, and so when you're gluing them, you want to have them nice and taped up so that the sides are nice and straight. Like I mentioned earlier, the lower hull and the upper hull are held on with fasteners in addition to glues. Now, the fasteners are pre-built into the molds and into the castings. There are several fasteners along the sponson of the vehicle. This is a mirror image on the reverse side. The fastener locations are a carryover from the pre-built release of this vehicle, in which you receive the tank pre-built and pre-painted. However, some assembly was required, and that assembly utilized several Phillips screws to go ahead and mount the upper and lower hulls together. On this model here, on the unassembled version, I did not see any supplied fasteners in the box, and on the instruction sheet, there were no fasteners labeled in the kit contents. As for the fasteners, I guess the kit, they wanted you to just use adhesives to glue the whole model together. Problem with just using adhesives is that the fasteners really do help in jigging the upper and lower hull halves together, in addition to also giving them more strength because it's the use of fastener instead of just adhesives. It gives you some more structural support. As for the fasteners, since the kit didn't supply them, I utilized the M3x12 Allen screw. These Allen screws here simply just thread into their locations that are supplied with the kit. No modifications were needed. I simply just take the screw and I just screw it into the tank until it reaches the end of its threading. One advantage of using an Allen screw as opposed to a Phillips is that the Allen, you get more grip on the bolt, and it's also a lot easier, I find, to install it into the vehicle as opposed to a Phillips head. Now with the two upper and lower halves together, I am now ready to start on the model's bodywork. All of the fastener locations on the sponsons are going to be deleted, welds are going to be added, and any other obstructions like this ancillary bit of detail here is going to be thoroughly removed. Moving our way to the rear portion of the vehicle, another important modification was made to the model's hull. That modification involves this small little bulkhead that we have here. On the Dragon kit original, the kit originally supplies you with this plastic pan that once installed mounts to the rear portion here of the vehicle, and this here replicates the bulkhead as well as becomes a mounting point for the flip grill, which is supplied with the kit. Problem with the kit component is that I felt it was a little bit too flimsy, and also the kit is actually missing the section of where the grill actually tucks and folds up into the hull. Another drawback that I found with using the kit component is that when it mounts to the vehicle, the piece is not perfectly square with the hull, and you get some kind of an angle going. That angle is incorrect, as this portion of the hull is supposed to be absolutely square with that of the rear. So rather than tinkering with the piece, I went ahead and replaced it altogether. The bulkheads that you see here are found on the EastCoastArmory.com product line and were originally developed for another make of 1/6 scale Sherman tanks. The kit itself is comprised of the following components. It has the side hull extenders, with molded in guard plate, and it also has the linear bulkhead itself. Since this setup here was designed for a different make of Sherman, it did require some fitting to get it to mate to the Dragon Sherman tank. What was done to make it fit the Dragon Sherman? Well, it had to do with this portion of the setup right here. This bulkhead, since it was shorter by about 1/4 inch on each side, I simply went ahead and casted a second shelf resin piece and added the missing 1/4 inch halves to it. Everything was then glued together, and once the width was corrected, it was a simple addition. Moving our way to the front portion of the model, we have here the transmission and the lower hull. On this build, I encountered a somewhat of a gap between where the two pieces connect. The gap itself is very simple to remove with standard modeling practices, namely I have just bodywork and a little bit of sanding. Since I have the transmission cover with its rough cast texture, it makes blending in the seam a lot easier. Another thing that was omitted on the Dragon kit that I strongly recommend doing is the addition of the side fasteners that are used to secure the transmission to the side hull on the real vehicle. These fasteners were omitted from the kit, and to add them, I simply utilized my M3x6 hex bolts that I use on all my builds. It's a simple procedure. You just mark off where they need to go, and you just drill them out. This simple addition here also greatly improves the look of the vehicle. Just like with the rear hull, I went ahead and plugged up the holes for the kit suspension. This is because the client specified to have the kit suspension replaced with the functional set from EastCoastArmory.com. Because of the new functional suspension, the kit indents were no longer required. To fill them up, I went ahead and created a resin plug that fits onto the inside of the vehicle, and once installed, you then just add some putty around the surface and sand until flush. These parts here are not intended to be used if you're going to utilize the kit suspension, and are only intended if the kit suspension is going to be replaced with either a VVSS set from East Coast Armory or the HVSS set from Panzerwork.com. Moving our way to the rear portion of the vehicle, I want to point out that on this portion here of the vehicle I encountered several fitting issues. This is where the rear plate mates up with that of the lower hull. I found that on this build that the plate for some reason was slightly smaller than that of the dimensions of the lower hull, and because of that resulted in some gapping issues as well as even a recess. It's not necessarily that prevalent on this side, however on the reverse side of the vehicle, bodywork was needed to be added to this whole corner over here in order to make it nice and flush with that of the lower hull. Moving our way up from the side hull, we have the newly completed sponson work. As you can see, since the last scene, the bodywork has been added to the sponson, deleting the screw locations and entombing the fasteners into the model. The locations themselves have been sanded flush with the bodywork and are no longer going to be visible once the model gets painted. In addition to the fastener holes being deleted, the little bit of ancillary molded in details have been thoroughly removed and sanded flush. The sponsons also received their welding detail that we have here. The welds are sculpted out of an epoxy. In addition to the sponson work, what was also added was the fender mounts on both the front and rear portion of the vehicle. Because I will not be using the kit plastic fenders, I went ahead and fabricated a metal plate in order to bolt on my metal fenders as the build progresses. The mounting plate is just a simple steel plate with the 3 securing holes affixed or drilled in for that of the fender. And as for mounting it to the vehicle, I went ahead and utilized 2 small slot screw fasteners. Because of the very high traffic and snag location of these fenders, it is very important to utilize fasteners for this application. Like the front portion of the vehicle, I went ahead at this stage of the build and added the rear mounts for the rear fenders. Like the front fender mount, the rear fender mount is also fabricated out of sheet metal, is affixed to the vehicle with fasteners as well as adhesives, and has its 3 small fastener holes located in the plate. Now, if we notice, the plate is a lot different than that of the front in that it comes out and bends down. Also, if we notice that the plate does not run all the way to the end of the sponson. This is not a mistake. This is true for these M4A3 Sherman tanks. The purpose for this little indentation here is because of the Little Joe auxiliary generator exhaust pipe, which we have here. The exhaust pipe emerges from the rear portion of the sponson, and because of that, the fender mounts end short. This is true on both the left and right-hand portions of the vehicle, even though the right-hand portion of the vehicle does not feature the Little Joe auxiliary generator exhaust stack. Moving up from the suspension, another portion of the build the model that I went ahead and altered was that of the side hull. This Sherman model is just like any other plastic Sherman vehicle on a smaller scale in that Dragon went ahead and molded in the fender mounts directly to the side of the hull. The fender mounts looked identical to that on their smaller scale vehicles in that it was just a detailless plastic strip that was integrally molded into the bottom portion of the plate. On the real Sherman tank, this strip would have been slightly lower than the molded in counterpart. The strip itself is intended for use to bolt on the side skirts. Also, it could be used to bolt on the extended fenders for use with HVSS equipped Sherman tanks. The plates themselves were just perforated steel strips that were welded to the vehicle and hung slightly below the sponson line. The Dragon molded in strip was just a detailless, unperforated, solid plastic strip that ran across the portion of the plate. To remove this section was fairly easy. I went ahead and utilized a large drum sander that we have here. This is a bit for a drill, and in concept it's nothing more than a very large version for the ones that are found on Dremels. You can use the same procedure with a drum with the sanding drum, but you have to be very careful in that you just want to get just enough of the material removed without over sanding into the plate. Once the piece was removed, I went ahead and sanded everything nice and flush with a palm sander. Once the sanding is complete, as you can see, the plate is nice and smooth and is now ready for the rest of its detailing. One very important tip to relay to you, the viewer, is that on the Sherman, if you notice in my previous scene, I have the transmission completely assembled before the assembly of the hull. This includes adding the sides as well as the rivet strip and building it as one complete unit. The problem with doing this is that I found that when I went ahead and glued the upper and lower halves together, when I mounted on the transmission cover, the transmission bolt strip here was a slightly different angle than what it should have been when assembled on the vehicle. It actually sunk into the upper hull portion here, leaving a very bad shelf and an improper indent, which needed to be corrected. In order to correct it, I went ahead with the Multimax and I carefully removed the seam here to where it was originally glued on. Once the rivet strip was removed, I went ahead and reinstalled it with the proper height that is necessary for the Sherman tank. Once the piece was glued together, I went ahead and simply blended in the cast texture with the rest of the model. But if anyone is building their Dragon Sherman tank, I strongly recommend building the model first with the upper hull and the lower hull and with the transmission cover, and then simply mounting on the rivet strip once the lower and hull is conjoined as one piece. And that concludes this project update video for this 1/6 scale Dragon M4A3 Sherman tank. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, and don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 scale tank builds, as well as other 1/6 scale detail components. Thank you.